On the most important night of his political campaign, millionaire Richard Harrison was at the peak of his glory, giving a speech to Chicago's elite alongside his son Timothy in the luxurious grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton. But in a matter of seconds, a simple phrase from a child would turn his perfect life into a public nightmare. When Timothy pointed to a mysterious boy at the back of the room and shouted, "Dad, that's my brother," Richard saw 9 years of carefully kept secrets explode in front of 400 witnesses and a dozen cameras. What followed was a devastating confession that not only destroyed his career, but revealed a truth that would forever change the fate of 2 innocent children. Get ready for a story of redemption, forgiveness, and the transformative power of truth, even when it costs you everything you've built.
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
The grand ballroom at the Beverly Hills Hotel sparkled like a finely cut jewel under the glow of 5 enormous baccarat crystal chandeliers, each worth more than a suburban home. The soft murmur of elegant conversations blended with the delicate clinking of Dom Perignon champagne glasses, creating a symphony of wealth and sophistication that echoed against the walls draped in golden silk. Richard Harrison adjusted the cuffs of his Italian silk shirt, the fabric sliding smoothly against his sun-kissed skin. At 45, he exuded a confidence born from decades of building a real estate empire stretching from Manhattan to the skyscrapers of Miami. His Armani tuxedo fit perfectly over broad shoulders, every line tailored to highlight his commanding 6'2" frame. "Dad, isn't that lady over there the Oscar-winning actress?" whispered Timothy, his brown eyes shining with childish curiosity as he watched a stunning woman in a red dress chatting near the heart-shaped ice bar. Richard smiled, gently running his hand through his son's perfectly styled blonde hair. The 8-year-old was impeccable in his bespoke little tuxedo, a miniature version of his father's elegance. "Yes, Timothy. And see that silver-haired man talking to her? That's the mayor of Los Angeles." Richard leaned in slightly, his voice low, carrying the pride of someone who knew every important figure in the room personally. "Remember what I always tell you. The right people open the right doors." Timothy finished with a mischievous smile, reciting the mantra he had heard hundreds of times. "My smart boy." The air was scented with the fragrance of white orchids imported from Thailand, adorning each table along with red roses and pink peonies. Round tables draped with hand-embroidered Irish linen accommodated 10 guests each, set with Limoges porcelain plates and Waterford crystal that reflected the lights like tiny rainbows. Richard moved through the crowd with the grace of a polished predator. Every step calculated, every smile strategic. His presence was magnetic. Conversations paused as he approached. People instinctively turned toward him like sunflowers following the sun. "Richard, my dear friend," the deep voice of Robert Sterling, California senator, cut through the buzz. The 60-year-old man approached with open arms, his prominent belly barely concealed by a high-end tuxedo. "Robert, what a pleasure to see you." Richard extended his hand. The two shook hands with the familiarity of old allies. "Senator, this is my son Timothy." The boy extended his small hand with perfect posture, honed by etiquette lessons at New York's finest prep schools. "It's an honor to meet you, sir," Timothy said clearly and politely. "What an impressive boy," Sterling laughed, clearly delighted. "You're raising a future leader, Richard." In the background, a chamber orchestra played Vivaldi softly, the delicate violin notes floating above the heads of the 300 most influential guests on the West Coast. Waiters dressed in white glided silently between groups, offering canapes of beluga caviar and black truffle on artisanal toast points. Richard felt the familiar rush of power pulsing through his veins as he surveyed his domain. Every person in that room was a connection, an opportunity, a rung on his endless climb. It wasn't just about the money, though his $8 billion net worth certainly helped. It was about influence, the power to shape entire cities with a single phone call. "Dad, I feel important when I come to these events with you," Timothy murmured, gently squeezing his father's hand. Richard felt his heart warm. His blue eyes, usually cold and calculating in business, softened as he looked at his son. Timothy was his greatest achievement, more valuable than any skyscraper or million-dollar deal. "You are important, my son. Never forget that." An elegant woman with silver hair approached, Margaret Thornton, socialite and event organizer, wearing a pearl necklace once owned by European royalty. "Richard, darling, it's time," she said, lightly touching his arm with fingers adorned with diamond rings. "Everyone's eager to hear your words." The crowd's murmur gradually quieted as Margaret stepped onto the small, improvised stage at the center of the room. The sound of her silver spoon tapping delicately on a crystal glass echoed like a church bell. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, a man whose generosity has transformed the lives of thousands of underprivileged children, Richard Harrison." The silence that followed was shattered by an outburst of warm applause. Timothy smiled proudly as hundreds of eyes turned toward his father. Camera flashes burst like silent fireworks, capturing every moment as Richard kissed his son's forehead and walked toward the stage. The golden light from the chandeliers seemed to focus on him as he ascended the 3 marble steps, creating an almost celestial aura around his imposing figure. This was his moment, his kingdom, his world where he reigned absolute and unchallenged. The spotlights focused on Richard like beams of golden sunlight, turning the stage into an altar of divine light. His elegant silhouette stood out against the navy blue velvet backdrop adorned with the Golden Hearts for Children logo, while Timothy remained by his side like a young prince, his presence radiating the pure innocence of childhood. Richard adjusted the silver microphone with steady hands, his blue eyes scanning the audience of 400 expectant faces. The silence was so deep you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional faint clink of a glass being set down on a table. "Good evening, my dear friends." His voice resonated through the hall, rich and melodious like aged whiskey. "When Margaret invited me to speak tonight, I thought long and hard about what I could share with you. Then I looked at this little man beside me." Richard placed his hand on Timothy's shoulder, who smiled brightly and waved shyly to the audience. A collective murmur of approval swept through the room, accompanied by maternal and paternal smiles recognizing the beauty of that intimate moment shared publicly. And I realized that the only truth worth sharing is about the miracle of fatherhood. The cameras clicked relentlessly, flashes flickering like shooting stars as reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Richard knew exactly how to pose, how to tilt his head slightly to catch the light just right, how to make his expression convey both strength and vulnerability. 8 years ago, he continued, his voice taking on a more intimate, personal tone, I was simply Richard Harrison, the businessman. I had buildings with my name engraved on bronze plaques, contracts worth millions of dollars, meetings that decided the future of entire cities. But I had no idea what it truly meant to be rich. Timothy looked up at his father with pure adoration shining on his angelic face. The boy had been trained for moments like these, but his admiration for his dad was genuine, radiating from him like the warmth of a fireplace on a cold winter night. It was when this little miracle came into my life that I discovered true wealth. Richard paused strategically, letting his words echo in the hearts of the parents in the audience. The wealth of waking up in the morning to a smile worth more than all the vaults in the world. The wealth of feeling small arms wrapped around my neck when I come home after a tough day. A woman in the front row discreetly wiped her eyes with a silk-embroidered handkerchief. In the background, waiters had paused their tasks, leaning against the walls to listen to the touching words that seemed to come straight from the heart. My friends, we are privileged. Very privileged. Richard gestured gracefully toward the elegant audience. We have the power to change lives, to bring hope where once there was only darkness. But more importantly, we have the responsibility to remember that every child, deserves what Timothy received from me and what I have received from him in return. The boy straightened his shoulders, clearly understanding he was an integral part of his father's message. His rosy cheeks glowed under the lights, and he occasionally waved to familiar faces in the crowd, drawing emotional smiles from women whose own children had already grown and gone to college. You know why we founded the Harrison Foundation for Children, Richard went on, his voice gaining strength and passion. It's not just charity. It's an investment in the future of humanity. Every child we take off the streets, every child we put into school, every child who receives a loving home, is a seed of hope we plant in the garden of tomorrow. Applause broke out spontaneously, waves of approval sweeping through the room like emotional dominoes. Richard gently raised his hand, asking for silence to continue, and the audience obeyed instantly, like subjects before a benevolent king. "But let me tell you something I've learned as a father," he said, his voice lowering to a more intimate, confident tone. "Love doesn't divide. It multiplies. The more love we give, the more love we have to give. Timothy has taught me that every day for the last 8 years." The boy smiled even wider, clearly recognizing his name and feeling the warmth of his father's love flowing through the words. His brown eyes shone with genuine happiness that touched everyone present. "Every night, when I put this little man to bed, he asks me about his day at school, about his dreams, about what he wants to be when he grows up." Richard paused, feigning emotion, though part of it was real. "And I realized that in those moments I'm not Richard Harrison, the businessman. I'm simply Dad. And there's no title in the world I'd rather have." Tears streamed down the faces of several women in the audience. Hardened men, shaped by years of battles in courtrooms and boardrooms, felt a tightness in their chests as they remembered their own children waiting for them at home. Which is why, when I see an abandoned child, a child without hope, a child who has never felt the unconditional love that every human being deserves. Richard paused dramatically, his eyes scanning every face in the room. "I see Timothy. I see what he could have been if destiny had been different. And that breaks my heart." The silence was absolute now, charged with pure emotion. Even the waiters seemed to hold their breath, caught by the intensity of the moment. Richard took a deep breath, preparing for the emotional climax of his words. His hand gently squeezed Timothy's shoulder, who looked back at him with eyes full of filial love. The cameras captured every nuance, every gesture, every moment of this seemingly perfect scene that felt as genuine as a heartbeat. "Tonight, looking at all of you, looking at this angel by my side, I want to share the deepest truth I've discovered about being a father. The deepest truth I've discovered about being a father is that..." Richard's words flowed melodiously, like a well-rehearsed symphony, each syllable carefully crafted to touch the hardest hearts in the audience. The reverent silence hanging over the grand ballroom was almost sacred. 400 people breathed as one, like a single emotional entity suspended by the strings of Richard's paternal eloquence. Tears glistened in the eyes of dozens of mothers. Fathers leaned forward in their padded chairs, and even the waiters had paused their service to absorb every precious word. Then, like a bolt of lightning cutting through a serene sky, everything changed. Timothy, who had been the perfect picture of a golden childhood, suddenly stopped smiling. His brown eyes, which moments before shone with filial adoration, fixed on some distant point in the elegant crowd. His little brow furrowed in confusion, like a child trying to solve a puzzle too complex for his age. Richard, still lost in the hypnotic rhythm of his own words, didn't immediately notice the change in his son. His voice kept flowing, rich and engaging. "True love knows no limits, no borders, no." Timothy's angelic face gradually transformed. The confusion gave way to recognition, like dawn slowly lighting a familiar landscape. His eyes widened, his small mouth opened slightly, and an expression of pure innocent surprise took over his delicate features. Then, cutting through the solemn air of the ballroom like a sharp blade, Timothy's high, clear voice echoed across the grand ballroom. "Daddy, that's my brother." His small arm extended dramatically, the index finger pointing with the absolute certainty only a child can have. His voice, amplified by the nearby microphone and the room's perfect acoustics, reverberated against the silk-lined walls like a child's battle cry. The silence that followed was more deafening than any explosion. It was the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes, heralds catastrophe, marks the exact moment a perfect world begins to crumble. The air seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room, leaving 400 people breathless at once. Richard felt the blood drain from his face as if someone had opened a faucet in his veins. His blue eyes, usually so controlled and calculating, widened in pure primal horror. The phrase forming on his lips died instantly, the words disintegrating in his throat like soggy paper. His hands, which seconds before held the microphone with the confidence of a conductor leading an orchestra, began to tremble visibly. The silver metal vibrated between his fingers like a wounded bird trying to escape, and the sound of this trembling was picked up and amplified for the whole audience to hear. "Timothy, my dear, Richard whispered desperately, his voice hoarse and broken, trying to smile but managing only a grotesque grimace that distorted his aristocratic features. But Timothy was undeterred. With the innocent stubbornness of childhood, he kept pointing. His little arms stretched like an arrow aimed at the heart of the truth. His rosy cheeks were flushed with excitement, and he bounced slightly on his feet, like a child who just spotted his favorite sweet in a bakery window. "That's him, Daddy! He's my brother!" Timothy shouted again, his voice slicing through the heavy air like a blaring siren. 400 heads turned in unison, like a macabre ballet of morbid curiosity. The movement was so synchronized it seemed choreographed. Necks stretched, bodies leaned forward, chairs creaked on the polished marble. It was like watching a human wave of shock and fascination sweep through the room. The photographers, trained to capture moments of drama, reacted with the speed of hungry predators. Their cameras moved like cannons on a battlefield, pivoting swiftly between Richard's pale, sweating face and the direction Timothy insisted on pointing. Flashes exploded like fireworks, creating a strobe light storm that turned the moment into something surreal and cinematic. The murmurs began low, like the distant buzzing of bees, but quickly grew in volume and intensity. Voices whispered names, theories, speculation. "What brother? Richard only has one son." "My God, did you see his face? Where is the boy pointing? Does anyone know what he's talking about?" Margaret Thornton, the event organizer, sat in the front row with wide eyes, her pearls bouncing as she turned her head frantically between Richard and the crowd, trying to process what was happening at her perfect event. Senator Sterling, who just minutes ago had smiled fatherly at Timothy, now frowned with the expression of a politician sniffing out a potential scandal. His wife gripped his arm tightly, her fingers digging into his tuxedo sleeve like claws. Richard tried to compose himself, running his free hand through his perfectly styled hair but only managed to mess it up, sending unruly strands falling over his sweaty forehead. His forced smile trembled like a candle flickering in a storm. "Timothy, son, maybe you're confused," he whispered into the microphone, his voice echoing through the room like a desperate plea. But the atmosphere had already changed irreversibly. The golden, elegant celebration had turned into something darker, tenser. It was as if a dark cloud had passed over the sun, casting shadows where there was once only light. The cameras kept clicking relentlessly, capturing every second of Richard Harrison's transformation from exemplary father to desperate man. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens sliding across paper like ice skaters, recording every word, every gesture, every nuance of this dramatic turn of events. All eyes now turned toward the direction of Timothy's small, insistent finger, desperately trying to identify who had caused this primal disruption in Richard Harrison's perfect world. The air was charged with electric anticipation, like the moments before a devastating storm. The focus of the 400 faces turned like a tsunami of curiosity toward the shadows near the double-service doors, where the golden light from the crystal chandeliers didn't shine as brightly. There, like an apparition from another world, stood a boy. Marcus, he was about 8 years old, the same angelic age as Timothy, but he carried on his small shoulders the weight of a completely different life. His white dress shirt was impeccably clean, but the fibers, worn from time and repeated washing, told a story of meticulous care with limited resources. The buttons had a dull shine, polished many times to hide small scratches. His navy blue dress pants had been patched with such skill that only sharp eyes noticed the small spots where the fabric had been carefully repaired, each patch a silent declaration of dignity preserved despite the circumstances. The black shoes on his small feet shined with fresh polish, but the worn soles and deep creases in the leather revealed years of walking, years of a childhood lived very differently from Timothy's. The boy was visibly nervous, like a little bird that had accidentally flown inside a cathedral. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, and he swallowed repeatedly, but there was something more in his dark eyes. A fierce determination that burned like embers amid the storm of emotions sweeping through the grand ballroom. It was obvious someone had gone to great lengths to make Marcus look presentable for that night. Every piece of his outfit was chosen and prepared with love and care, but it couldn't completely hide the stark difference between his world and the golden universe surrounding him in that moment. The event's security reacted instantly, like antibodies in a social immune system. Two tall, imposing men, dressed in discreet but expensive black suits, moved toward Marcus with the silent efficiency of trained professionals. Their faces were masks of polite neutrality, but their bodies moved with the clear intent to discreetly remove that contamination from the perfect environment. But before they could reach the boy, Timothy's clear voice cut through the heavy air of the hall again. "I know him. He showed up at my school and said he had the same name as me." Timothy's words exploded over the crowd like an emotional bomb. The previous silence vanished instantly, replaced by a cacophonous burst of shocked murmurs, muffled exclamations, and the nervous clinking of jewelry and glasses being held by trembling hands. "Oh my God! What does this mean? The same name? What do you mean, the same name? Richard. Did you see Richard's face? Someone call security." "No, wait. Let the boy speak." Richard felt the world crumble around him like a house of cards in a windstorm. All the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin with the waxy pallor of melted candle wax. His hands, which had been trembling barely noticeably, now gripped the microphone so tightly his knuckles turned white like polished bone. The microphone had become his only anchor in a sea of panic that threatened to swallow him whole. Reporters went into an absolute frenzy, like sharks smelling blood in the water. Cameras clicked in a strobing storm of flashes, each snap capturing a different moment of Richard's growing despair. Journalists pushed each other, scrambling for the best angle, the best photo, the best perspective on what was clearly becoming the scandal of the century. Harrison, who is that boy? Richard, can you comment on these allegations? How long have you known he existed?" The reporters' shouts mixed with the shocked murmurs of Chicago's social elite, creating a chaotic symphony of voices that echoed through the marble walls like distant thunder. Margaret Thornton stood in her front row chair, her pearls swinging violently as she gestured to the guards, clearly torn between protecting her event and allowing the drama to unfold. Her normally composed, aristocratic face was twisted into an expression of social horror she couldn't hide. But Marcus, the small center of this storm, did not flee. Against all expectations, against every instinct for self-preservation a child in his position should have had, he did not run when he saw the guards approaching. Instead, he did something that shocked the elegant crowd even more. He lifted his chin. With a small but deeply meaningful movement, Marcus raised his young face, straightened the small shoulders beneath his carefully pressed dress shirt, and looked directly through the sea of shocked faces, beyond the golden lights and suffocating opulence, through the chaos and confusion, straight into the terrified eyes of Richard Harrison. It was a look that transcended age, transcended circumstances, transcended the social chasm that separated them at that moment. In Marcus's dark eyes was a devastating mix of recognition, pain, hope, and a courage that seemed impossible in someone so young. He knew exactly who Richard was, and now Richard knew he knew. The visual showdown between them was like two worlds colliding in space. The golden, protected world of Richard Harrison, built on carefully crafted lies, and the raw, honest world of Marcus, where truth was the only currency that really mattered. Richard felt his legs buckle under the weight of that stare. It was as if Marcus could see through all the layers of social varnish, through every carefully constructed mask, straight into the man Richard really was beneath all that performance. The cameras captured every nuance of that epic moment. The deadly paleness of Richard, the fierce determination in Marcus's eyes, Timothy still pointing innocently on stage, the audience in a collective state of shock. It was the kind of confrontation that would define lives, change destinies, and mark the exact moment when the past stops being past and inevitably becomes present. The air in the grand ballroom was so charged with electric tension it felt like lightning might start striking from the crystal chandeliers at any moment. 400 people held their breath collectively, waiting to see which of the two would blink first in this deadly game of stares that would determine the future for all of them. The two security guards approached Marcus with calculated, professional movements, their faces maintaining the impassive mask of those used to handling delicate situations. The taller one, a broad-shouldered man with a small earpiece shining in his ear, reached out toward the boy with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, kid. Let's take care of this outside," he whispered, his voice low but firm, trying to keep the discretion the situation demanded. But Timothy, with the astonishing speed only a determined child can muster, jumped off the stage like a little emotional projectile. His polished leather shoes struck the gleaming marble floor, echoing through the ballroom like gunshots, and he began running toward Marcus, arms outstretched like a bird trying to fly. "No, don't take my brother away," Timothy shouted, his high voice cutting through the air like a siren, his bow tie flapping wildly as he ran. The guards stopped abruptly, like soldiers given conflicting orders, their professional faces twisted into expressions of complete confusion. How to proceed when the host's own son was defending the intruder? It was a situation no security manual had prepared them for. The shorter guard looked desperately toward the stage, searching for guidance from Richard, but found only a man completely frozen, like a wax figure melting under hot lights. Richard stood on the stage like an actor who had forgotten his lines mid-play. The microphone trembled in his hands like a leaf in a storm, and his mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish out of water gasping for air. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead, reflecting the golden ballroom lights like tiny diamonds of despair. In the front row, Catherine Harrison rose with a sharp movement, dragging her chair across the marble with a screech that cut through the chaotic voices for a moment. She was the very image of feminine elegance. A navy silk dress that had cost more than a car, a genuine pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, blonde hair perfectly styled in a sophisticated bun. But now, her aristocratic face was twisted into an expression of horror and utter confusion. Her pale blue eyes, normally so controlled and composed, darted frantically between her husband frozen on stage, her son running through the room, and the mysterious boy who had turned her perfect life into a public nightmare. "Richard?" she called out, her normally melodious voice now hoarse with shock. "Richard, what's going on?" But Richard couldn't answer. He couldn't even look at her, the guests, who only minutes before had been seated respectfully in their cushioned chairs, now rose like a tidal wave of morbid curiosity. Men in flawless tuxedos leaned over tables. Women in high-fashion gowns leaned dangerously forward, all trying to catch every nuance of the drama unfolding before their eyes. "Oh my God! Are you seeing this? Who is that boy? Catherine looks like she's going to faint. Somebody record this." Timothy reached Marcus before the guards could decide what to do next. With the absolute naturalness of childhood, he took the older boy's hand, intertwining his small fingers like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. Then, turning to face the entire elegant crowd with the innocent confidence of a child who didn't fully understand the chaos he was causing, Timothy shouted in his clear, ringing voice, "Your name is Harrison, too, just like mine." The revelation hit the audience like a lightning bolt. Harrison, the sacred surname, the name that opened doors, moved mountains, and represented power and prestige all over Chicago. And now this mysterious boy, dressed in carefully patched clothes and worn shoes, carried that same name. The explosion of whispers that followed was deafening. Voices mixed into a cacophonous chorus of shock, speculation, and delicious scandal. "Harrison?" He said, "Harrison. That can't be true. Look at Richard's face. My God. This is a scandal." Cameras clicked like machine guns, capturing every second of the revelation. Reporters whispered urgently into their phones, voices low but frantic. "Yes, you heard right, Harrison. No, I'm not joking. We need a team here now." Senator Sterling, who had been seated at the head table, went completely pale. His wife gripped his arm so tightly, her perfectly manicured nails left marks on the sleeve of his tuxedo. Margaret Thornton looked on the verge of a nervous breakdown, frantically fanning herself with her event program. Then Richard finally found his voice, but what came out was only a desperate, broken whisper. "Timothy, Timothy, come here now." But there was no authority in those words. No paternal firmness Timothy was used to obeying. It was the voice of a defeated man, a man whose world was crumbling in real time before 400 witnesses and a dozen cameras. Timothy looked at his father on the stage, confused by the weakness in his voice, but he didn't let go of Marcus's hand. The younger boy seemed to instinctively sense that something very important was happening. Something beyond his understanding, but somehow dependent on him, and it was at that moment of absolute tension, when the entire grand ballroom hung in a silence heavy with electric anticipation, that Marcus did something no one expected. He took a step forward with Timothy still holding his hand. Marcus moved slightly ahead, his worn but polished shoes echoing on the marble floor. He lifted his small but proud head, looked directly through all that opulence, through all those shocked faces, through the social and emotional chasm that separated him from the man on stage, and with a clear, courageous voice that cut the silence like a sharp blade, Marcus asked, "Are you my father?" The three words echoed through the grand ballroom like thunder, bouncing off the marble walls, the crystal chandeliers, and the hearts of 400 people who had just witnessed the moment a carefully guarded secret exploded like a bomb in the heart of Chicago society. Richard felt his legs give out. The microphone slipped slightly from his sweaty hand, and for a terrible moment, he thought he would faint right there on the stage in front of everyone. The question hung in the air like a death sentence, waiting for an answer that everyone knew would change everything forever. Marcus's question, "Are you my father?" kept echoing off the marble walls of the grand ballroom like a ghost refusing to rest. Each syllable reverberated through the golden corners of the room, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers and returning to haunt Richard Harrison like an endless echo of his own damnation. Richard stumbled off the stage like a drunk man, but not from alcohol, drunk with panic, despair, and a reality that had finally come to collect its debt after years of carefully built lies. His steps were unsteady, uncoordinated, and he had to lean against the side of the stage to keep from falling completely. His face, which a moment ago had radiated confidence and political charm, was now gray as wet concrete. Sweat glistened on his forehead and ran down his temples, staining the perfectly starched collar of his dress shirt. His hands shook violently, like leaves caught in an autumn storm. Catherine Harrison moved toward her husband with the speed of a desperate woman. Her crystal heels clicked on the marble like tiny hammers of urgency, and when she reached Richard, her manicured hands clutched his arm like claws. "Richard, what's happening?" she whispered urgently in his ear. Her voice, usually controlled, was now rough with panic. "Who is that boy?" "Richard, answer me." But Richard seemed to be in another world. A world where her words sounded distant and impossible to grasp. His eyes were locked on Marcus, as though the boy was a ghost he feared might vanish if he blinked. The press had erupted into a frenzy, turning the elegant setting into something resembling a war zone. Camera flashes fired like relentless lightning, creating a strobe storm of white light that made shadows dance on the walls like demons. Reporters jostled each other, trying to get closer, their voices merging into a desperate chorus. "Mr. Harrison, a statement." "Who is the boy?" "Richard." "Catherine, did you know about this child?" Harrison, "Confirm or deny." Timothy, realizing something terrible was happening to his father, darted through the chaos like a sharp arrow of filial concern. His small legs carried him quickly to Richard, and he gripped his father's tuxedo sleeve hard, his blue eyes shining with tears of confusion. "Daddy, Daddy, why didn't you ever tell me I had a brother?" Timothy asked, his voice small but piercing. "Why doesn't he live with us? Why are his clothes different from mine?" The pure innocence of Timothy's question stabbed Richard's heart like a dagger. He knelt slowly in front of his son, his knees hitting the cold marble with a sound that echoed through the silent room. His hands trembled violently as he touched Timothy's angelic face, feeling the soft warmth of his skin against his chilled palms. "Son, I didn't know," Richard began, but his voice shattered like broken glass. The words broke in his throat. Mixed with tears he could no longer hold back that it was a lie, and everyone in the room seemed to know it. But it was also the only thing Richard could say at that moment, the only fragile protection he could offer the son who was innocent in all this. Across the space separating them, Marcus stood frozen, but his young voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. "My mother told me you were my father." Each word was clear and determined, filled with a courage that seemed impossible for someone so young. She showed me pictures of you in the newspapers, clippings she kept in a box under the bed. That's why I came here. The silence that followed was deadly. 400 people exhaled collectively, yet no one dared make a sound. It was as if the entire grand ballroom had turned into a cathedral, where a final confession was being heard. Marcus continued, his voice small but unwavering. She said you were important, that you had a lot of money, that you lived in a big house. She said maybe one day you could help us. He paused, swallowing hard. But she got sick, and the doctors said she wouldn't get better. Before going to the hospital the last time, she gave me your address and told me to come here if anything happened to her. Catherine let out a low moan of understanding and horror. Her hands covered her mouth, as if trying to keep reality from breaking into her perfect life. Tears began to stream down her carefully made-up face, creating dark rivers of mascara. She looked at Richard with an expression mixing anger, hurt, and a growing disbelief that seemed to consume her from the inside out. It was the look of a woman who had just discovered that her entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. Richard, she whispered, but couldn't finish the sentence. Richard rose slowly, like a man carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. His eyes deliberately surveyed the landscape of his destruction. First, Marcus, with eyes dark and full of a truth he could no longer deny. Then the crowd of expectant faces, friends, colleagues, political rivals, all waiting to see how he would handle the greatest crisis of his life. Finally, the cameras recording every moment of his public ruin, every second of his fall from grace. The air was so tense it felt like it could shatter at any moment. The golden lights of the ballroom seemed dimmer now, as if even they were fading under the weight of the drama unfolding. Richard felt the weight of every gaze on him. Every camera pointed in his direction. Every debt finally coming due. There was nowhere to run, no lie big enough to cover this truth, no political spin to turn this moment into anything but what it was. The end of everything he had built. He looked one last time at Marcus, into those dark eyes reflecting his own face, into that determination he recognized as his own, into the courage coming from a place he had forgotten existed inside him, and in that terrible, freeing moment of clarity, Richard Harrison realized there was no escape. The truth, hidden in the shadows for years, had finally found the light, and it demanded to be acknowledged, no matter the cost. The moment of choice had come, and there was no turning back. Richard walked back onto the stage with steps that seemed to carry the weight of a heavenly judgment. Each movement was deliberate, yet heavy as molten lead, as if his feet were being pulled down by gravitational forces only he could feel. The path to the stage, which moments before he had walked with the confidence of a conqueror, now stretched out before him like a final walk to the gallows. The stage steps creaked under his weight, a sound that echoed through the deadly silence of the grand ballroom like breaking bones. When he reached the microphone, his hands trembled so violently that the metal stand swayed, creating a low, ominous feedback that made some people in the audience flinch. Richard gripped the microphone with both hands, trying to control the shaking that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his soul. His knuckles were white from squeezing so hard, and for a terrible moment, he thought his legs would give out right there on stage, in front of everyone. He took a deep breath, air entering his lungs like ground glass, and looked at the expectant crowd. 400 pairs of eyes were fixed on him with a burning intensity, like interrogation spotlights. Every face in the audience had turned into a silent judge, waiting for his confession. 9 years ago, Richard began, his voice initially weak like a ghostly whisper barely caught by the microphone. 9 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. The silence in the hall became absolute, so deep that you could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning and the nearly imperceptible tick-tock of the old clock on the wall. It was as if time itself had stopped to witness that confession. Richard cleared his throat, and his voice gained strength, not from courage, but from pure desperation, the desperate need to finally purge the poison he had carried in his chest for almost a decade. I had a relationship. He paused, the next word seeming to burn his tongue like molten iron. An affair with a woman named Maria Santos. The audience erupted into shocked whispers that rippled through the room like waves breaking on a shore. Voices blended into a collective murmur of scandal and disbelief. Maria Santos? My God. He really is confessing. This is going to ruin his career. Channel 7? Are you recording this? Catherine, who stood beside the stage like a marble statue draped in silk, slowly covered her face with her hands. Her perfectly manicured nails tangled in her blonde hair, and her body began to tremble like a leaf in a storm. Low sobs escaped through her fingers, broken sounds of a woman whose life was being shattered word by word. Richard continued, his voice now breaking like shattered glass. When she told me she was pregnant, He swallowed hard, fighting back tears that wanted to come. I didn't believe her. I thought she wanted my money. I thought she was trying to blackmail me, to tie me to her through a child I was sure wasn't mine. Marcus stood motionless where he was, his small hands clenched into tight fists. His dark eyes never left Richard's face, as if he were memorizing every expression, every word, every confession that finally explained a lifetime of unanswered questions. Timothy had stopped crying and now looked confused, shifting his gaze between his father on stage and the boy he had just discovered was his brother. His young mind struggled to process concepts far too adult, too complicated for his innocence. I pushed her away, Richard continued, now tears flowing freely down his face. I changed my phone number. I told my lawyers not to take her calls. I had my secretary tell her I had left town indefinitely. I never spoke to her again. The tears streaming down Richard's face sparkled under the golden lights like tiny rivers of liquid silver. His nose was red, his eyes swollen. All his political composure had evaporated, leaving only a broken man exposing his deepest wounds. Senator Sterling, seated at the head table, looked petrified. His wife gripped his arm so tightly her nails left marks, but he didn't seem to feel it. Margaret Thornton had completely fainted in her chair and needed to be fanned by other women. Reporters worked frantically. Some spoke quietly into their cell phones, others typed furiously on tablets, all capturing every second of what would be a worldwide headline before sunrise. I never knew she actually had the baby, Richard admitted, his voice breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. I never tried to find out. I convinced myself I did the right thing, that I was protecting my career, my future. I married Catherine, we had Timothy. I built this perfect life while my son. He stopped abruptly and looked directly at Marcus across the charged space of pain and truth. My other son was growing up without a father. The confession echoed through the grand ballroom like a final thunderclap. Every word was a stone thrown into the perfect lake of Richard Harrison's life, and now the waves spread in concentric circles of destruction that would touch every life in that room. The television reporters whispered urgently to their cameras. We're live at the grand ballroom, where Richard Harrison, a Senate candidate, has just confessed to abandoning a son. This is Melissa Chun from Channel 7, and you're watching what may be the end of the political career of one of Chicago's most powerful men. Chicago's high society was witnessing the public downfall of one of their own, and the shock was palpable. Women wearing million-dollar jewels fanned themselves with their programs. Men who moved financial markets whispered among themselves with expressions of horrified fascination. Richard took another deep breath, knowing there was one last truth that needed to be said, the final confession that would seal his fate forever. I abandoned my own blood, he said, his voice low but clear enough to be heard in every corner of the silent hall. Out of pride, out of cowardice, out of fear that the truth would destroy the perfect life I was building. The final words hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard Harrison, the man who had built an empire on charm, networking, and always knowing what to say, had finally told the truth. And that truth, hidden in the shadows for 9 years, was about to destroy everything he had worked to build. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with the weight of a lifetime of consequences finally coming due. With all eyes on him like spotlights on a lonely stage, Marcus gently stepped away from the security guards who had tried to hold him back. His movements were smooth and purposeful, not stubborn like a rebellious child, but with the natural grace of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. The guards, confused and emotionally shaken by how things unfolded, offered no resistance. Marcus walked toward the stage with small but determined steps, his worn shoes making soft sounds against the polished marble floor. The contrast was striking. This small boy, dressed simply but cleanly, moving through a sea of $1,000 tuxedos and high-fashion gowns like an angel lost in a world of materialism. When he stopped in the center of the hall, exactly where the golden light from the chandeliers met, Marcus raised his clear, innocent voice, cutting through the thick tension like a blade of purity. "I don't want your money, sir." The simplicity of those words fell on the crowd like a silent bomb. For 100 people used to a world where everything had a price, where every relationship was a transaction, and every favor came with a cost, were struck by the devastating force of a child's pure honesty. Richard suddenly stopped speaking, his mouth still open with words that would never be said. His eyes locked on the boy as if seeing a ghost. Not a ghost from the past, but from a future he had chosen to ignore. Tears on his face seemed frozen in place, crystallized by shock. Marcus continued, his youthful voice echoing through the hall with a clarity that made every word sound like a pure musical note. "My mom works really hard cleaning offices at night to support me." He spoke without shame or self-pity, just stating facts with the brutal honesty only children have. "She gets home at 5 in the morning, her hands red from cleaning products, but she always wakes me up with a kiss and asks about my homework." Catherine let out a soft sigh, almost inaudible, but echoing in her chest like thunder. The image of that unknown woman working through the night to support the abandoned son of her husband was a dagger to her privileged heart. "She never spoke ill of you," Marcus said, looking Richard directly in the eyes with a maturity beyond his years. "Never. When I asked why I didn't have a father like the other kids, she just said some stories are too complicated for children to understand. She said someday, when I was ready, I could meet you." Tears began to roll down Marcus's young face, but unlike his father, he didn't try to hide them. They ran freely, shining like liquid diamonds under the ballroom lights, yet his voice remained steady, unwavering in its truth. "I just wanted you to know that I exist." The devastating simplicity of those words made several people in the audience cover their faces with their hands. "I don't want to live in your big house or wear fancy clothes like Timothy. I just wanted a dad to hug me, like Timothy has." The purity and maturity of Marcus clashed brutally with the world of wealth and appearances around him. He was like a wildflower growing through concrete, his natural beauty making everything around him seem artificial and empty. His simple need, a father's hug, boiled down all political and social complexities to their most basic core. A child's love for his father. Senator Sterling abruptly stood from his chair, his hands trembling as he adjusted his tuxedo. His wife gripped his arm, whispering, "Robert, sit down, for God's sake." But he only shook his head, tears streaming down his aged face. "That child," he murmured. "That child has more dignity than all of us combined." Margaret Thornton had recovered from her fainting episode, only to be hit again by the emotional power of Marcus's words. She fanned herself frantically, whispering to anyone who would listen, my God, how could we have been so blind?" Timothy, who had been watching everything with wide eyes of dawning understanding, suddenly slipped from Catherine's grasp. His little legs carried him swiftly across the space between him and Marcus, driven by pure innocence, without thinking about consequences or the complexity of the moment. When he reached Marcus, Timothy extended his small hand and placed it in that of his newly found half-brother. Their fingers naturally, instinctively intertwined, as if recognizing each other on a level beyond explanation. "Can you really be my brother?" Timothy asked with the absolute sincerity of childhood, his small voice clear enough for everyone in the silent hall to hear. Marcus looked down at the boy with blue eyes who was his negative image. Where Marcus was dark, Timothy was light. Where Marcus wore simple clothes, Timothy was dressed like a little prince. But both shared the same nose shape, the same curve of lips, the same genes that bound them forever. "I always wanted a brother," Marcus answered softly, squeezing Timothy's small, soft hand. Catherine was crying silently now, tears rolling down her cheeks like rain on glass. But these were not tears of anger or despair. They were tears of recognition, witnessing something pure and true amid a chaos of lies and deception. The innocence of two children, finding in each other the family adult selfishness denied, was touching a place deep in her heart she thought had been lost long ago. The audience was completely silent, but this was a different silence. It wasn't the tense silence of anticipation or scandal, but the reverent quiet of people witnessing something sacred. Many looked visibly moved. Men who had built empires without shedding a tear now discreetly wiped their eyes. Women living in worlds of superficiality faced the raw, unvarnished truth of filial love. Richard stepped down from the stage a second time, but now his steps were completely different. There was no desperate hesitation or trembling uncertainty. His movements were deliberate, determined, like a man who had finally found his way after years lost in a labyrinth of his own making. The reporters kept filming, but even they seemed touched by the moment. Their cameras captured not just a political scandal, but a deeply human moment of recognition and possible redemption. Richard crossed the hall with steps that now echoed differently. No longer the hollow sound of a man fleeing his truth, but the solid sound of someone walking toward what he should have done long ago. When he finally stopped in front of Marcus, father and abandoned son looked into each other's eyes, fully aware of who they really were. Richard saw his own dark eyes reflected in the boy's face, but also the strength of a woman he had chosen to forget, the courage of a child who had found his way to him against all odds, and Marcus saw the man who had been a faded photo in a box beneath his mother's bed, now real and tangible before him, with tears in his eyes and an expression he had waited his whole life to see. The moment stretched between them like a bridge over 9 years of separation, heavy with the weight of all the lost chances and the fragile possibility of something new beginning to grow. Richard knelt slowly before Marcus, his knees touching the cold marble floor of the grand ballroom, as if he were genuflecting in a cathedral. The gesture brought him down to the boy's level, allowing their eyes to meet on equal ground. Not a powerful politician looking down, but a humbled man asking forgiveness from a child he had abandoned. The movement was so deliberate, so full of meaning, that a collective murmur of surprise echoed through the room. Richard Harrison, CEO of one of Chicago's largest companies, a Senate candidate, a man who had never bowed before anyone, was now kneeling on the marble floor, vulnerable like never before in public. His hands trembled slightly as he rested them on his knees, struggling to find the words he had carried for 9 years without ever having the courage to say. His breathing was uneven, weighed down by a lifetime of regret finally rising to the surface. With a voice choked with emotion but steady enough that every word could be clearly heard throughout the silent ballroom, Richard whispered, "Can you forgive me?" The words fell like a prayer, a plea that resonated in everyone's ears like a bell tolling through an empty church. The raw vulnerability in the voice of the man who had built an empire on control and power was heartbreaking. "Will you give me a chance to be the father you deserve?" Marcus remained still for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes studying the face of the man kneeling before him. Behind those young eyes, you could see a process unfolding, years of unanswered questions, nights wondering why he didn't have a father, finally finding context in the vulnerable figure before him. The boy took a deep breath and spoke with the innocent wisdom only children possess, that clear moral clarity untouched by the complexities of the adult world. "My mom told me everyone deserves a second chance, if their heart really changes." Marcus's words cut through the silence like divine absolution. The simplicity of Maria Santos, working every early morning cleaning offices, teaching forgiveness to the son she raised alone, echoed in those words with a dignity that humbled all the artificial sophistication of the ballroom. Richard could no longer hold back the tears he had kept so long. They streamed from his eyes like broken dams, running down his face with no attempt to control or preserve his image. They were tears of relief, regret, and gratitude for mercy he didn't deserve but was freely offered by a pure-hearted child, slowly. As if each move might shatter the fragile, sacred moment, Richard opened his arms. There was no pressure, no forced expectation, just a silent offer, an invitation Marcus could accept or refuse without judgment. Marcus looked at those open arms, and for a moment, time seemed to stop completely. Everyone in the grand ballroom collectively held their breath, witnessing a moment that transcended politics, scandals, or wealth. It was simply a father offering love and a son deciding if he could accept it. Then, with the confidence only innocence can bring, Marcus took a step forward and allowed himself to be embraced. The first contact was tentative, like two people learning to dance to a song they'd never heard before. Richard's arms closed around his son's small frame with reverent gentleness, as if holding something infinitely precious that could vanish at any moment. When Richard whispered against Marcus's dark hair, his voice broken but clear, "I'm sorry, my son. Sorry for all these lost years." Marcus felt something inside his small chest release. A tension he had carried without even knowing it was there. A question that lived in his heart ever since he understood that other kids had fathers and he did not. Then, as if an emotional dam had opened, Marcus hugged back with all the strength of his little arms. The embrace grew tighter. Father and son finally connected after 9 years of unnecessary separation. Richard could feel Marcus's small heart beating against his own chest, and the reality of having a son, this wonderful boy who had grown up without him, hit him with a force that nearly overwhelmed him. Timothy, who'd been watching wide-eyed, suddenly couldn't stay away any longer. With the impulsiveness of childhood, he threw himself into the hug, his little arms reaching to surround both his father and his newfound half-brother. "I want a hug too," Timothy declared with childlike honesty, creating a scene instantly captured by every reporter's camera in the room. The trio, Richard kneeling on the marble floor, holding both boys in his arms, created a photograph that would dominate the front pages around the world in the next 24 hours. But more than that, they created a moment of pure humanity amid a world of artifice. The audience was visibly moved. Senator Sterling had completely stopped trying to keep composed and was openly crying, tears falling onto his $2,000 tuxedo. Margaret Thornton shook her head repeatedly, murmuring, my God, how could we have been so hard, so blind?" Catherine, still standing where the boys had left her, watched the scene with silent tears flowing down her face. But they weren't tears of bitterness. They were tears of recognition, witnessing something she had never experienced herself with Richard. That pure, immediate connection between him and Marcus revealed a side of her husband she'd never seen, and also laid bare what was missing in her own marriage. Several men in the audience discreetly wiped their eyes with silk handkerchiefs. Women who had spent decades engaged in empty social competitions found themselves confronted with the raw reality of unconditional love. It was as if that child had stripped away a layer of varnish from that entire society, exposing the humanity beneath. After what felt like forever but was likely just a few minutes, Richard slowly rose, keeping both boys close. Marcus clung to his waist, as if fearing that if he let go, this father figure might disappear again. Timothy held his father's hand with one hand and Marcus's with the other, physically linking the family that had formed before everyone's eyes. Richard walked back to the microphone one last time, but now he was a completely changed man. The polished, calculating politician had been replaced by a humble, genuinely repentant father. His posture was different. Not the confident arrogance of someone who always knew how to control a situation, but the humility of someone who'd realized the most important things in life can't be controlled, only experienced. When he looked out at the audience, his eyes no longer held the manipulative spark of a seasoned politician. Instead, there was a new clarity, an honesty that made it impossible to doubt his sincerity. Cameras captured every nuance of his transformation, and even the most cynical reporters whispered among themselves about the radical change they had witnessed. Richard adjusted the microphone with one hand, the other resting on Marcus's shoulders, who still leaned against him like an emotional anchor. Timothy stood at their side, completing the image of a family reunited in the most unlikely way. The silence in the grand ballroom was different now, not tense or expectant, but respectful, almost reverent. Everyone knew they were about to hear words not from a political strategist or campaign consultant, but directly from the heart of a man who had been completely transformed by the events of the last 30 minutes. Richard took a deep breath, looked at Marcus beside him, then at Timothy, then at Catherine still standing among the crowd with tears streaming down her face, and finally at the 400 people who had witnessed his fall, and possibly his redemption. He was ready to make his final public statement, knowing the words he would say next would not only close this night but define the rest of his life. With Marcus and Timothy by his side, two small pillars of moral strength, Richard found his voice once again. But this time, the voice that emerged from him was completely transformed. Not the carefully rehearsed rhetoric of a seasoned politician, but something coming from the depths of his soul, shaped by newfound truth and humility. He held the microphone with one hand, keeping the other around Marcus's shoulders, and began to speak with a clarity that cut through all the layers of artifice that had defined his public life. Today, I didn't lose my reputation, I gained a son, and I discovered my true reflection. The words echoed through the grand ballroom with a power beyond volume. They were words loaded with the weight of genuine transformation. Richard paused, looking at Marcus beside him, seeing in the boy's dark eyes not the reflection of his own guilt, but the possibility of redemption. Then he looked directly at the audience, no longer trying to manipulate or impress, but simply sharing his truth. For years, I took pride in being a successful man, a philanthropist, an example. His voice carried a bitter irony, but not self-pity, just acknowledgement. I built buildings, created jobs, donated millions to noble causes. I told myself I was making a difference in the world. Senator Sterling, still standing amidst the crowd, shook his head slowly, recognizing his own story reflected in those words. How many of them had hidden behind philanthropy and professional success to avoid facing personal failings? But today, an 8-year-old child taught me what it really means to be a man. Richard lowered his gaze to Marcus, who watched him with that mix of cautious hope and unconditional love only children can carry. It's not about the money you have or the image you project. It's not about how many buildings bear your name or how many photos appear in newspapers. Timothy tugged at his father's jacket, whispering loud enough to be heard by the microphones. "Daddy, is he really my brother now?" The innocence of the question brought tearful smiles from several people in the audience. "It's about taking responsibility and loving unconditionally," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. "It's about being there when your children need you, not just when it's convenient or politically advantageous." The cameras captured every nuance of his expression. There was nothing left of the calculating politician. There was only a father who had finally found his way back home, even while standing in the middle of a ballroom full of strangers. Richard took a deep breath and made the next statements with the solemnity of someone making wedding vows. "Today, I announce that I will create an educational fund for Marcus, not as charity, but as a father's investment in his son's future." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "But more important than any money is my promise that I want to be a present father in his life. I want to take him to school, help with homework, teach him to ride a bike if he doesn't know how yet. I want to know his friends, his dreams, his fears." The emotion in his voice was palpable, and even the most cynical reporters stopped scribbling notes to simply watch a man publicly committing to fatherhood in the most vulnerable way possible. Catherine, who had stood still since the embrace of the three, finally began to move. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if she were navigating completely new emotional terrain. The clicking of her Louboutin heels on the marble floor created a hypnotic rhythm as she approached the stage. People stepped aside to make way for her, all watching with intense curiosity to see how the betrayed wife would react at this crucial moment. Catherine had married a man she thought she knew completely, only to discover there was an entire child she never knew existed. When she finally stopped in front of the small group on stage, Catherine first looked at Richard, not with anger or reproach, but with something that seemed like surprise. Maybe she was seeing her husband truly for the first time, without the social and political masks he always wore. Then she turned to Marcus, who watched her with that natural mixture of curiosity and apprehension a child has when meeting an unfamiliar adult in a charged situation. Catherine knelt down to be at the boy's level, mirroring the gesture Richard had made moments before. With a voice surprisingly steady, though touched by emotion, Catherine extended her gloved hand to Marcus. "If you are his son, you are welcome in our family." The gesture stunned everyone in the ballroom. Ripples of admiration and shock spread through the crowd like waves on a lake. No one had expected Catherine Harrison, known for her reserved nature and strict social protocols, to publicly embrace such a complicated situation with such grace. Marcus looked at the outstretched hand, then into Catherine's gentle blue eyes, and slowly placed his small brown hand into hers. The contrast was striking. The pale, smooth skin of Catherine against Marcus's darker skin and the small scars from childhood play. But when their fingers touched, it was as if a bridge had been built over an abyss everyone thought insurmountable. "Thank you, ma'am," Marcus said with the politeness his mother had taught him, making Catherine smile through her tears. The crowd's reaction was decidedly mixed. A significant portion began to applaud. recognizing the moral courage and possibility of redemption they were witnessing. The applause started sporadic but grew louder and more intense, echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling of the grand ballroom like distant thunder. But others whispered among themselves, their voices creating a constant murmur of speculation and judgment. "This is going to completely wreck his campaign," a woman whispered to her companion. "How can she accept this so easily?" Another man murmured, shaking his head. "This scandal is going to follow this family for years." Richard heard the whispers, saw the divided expressions in the crowd, but for the first time in his adult life, he realized he simply didn't care about other people's opinions. There was something more valuable at stake now, something no amount of money could buy or political maneuvering could conquer. He had the truth, and a second chance to be a father. The event was clearly drawing to a close, but not with the political grand finale everyone expected. Instead, it ended with something much more precious and rare. A family discovering itself amidst the chaos of public expectations. As guests slowly began to disperse, still processing all they had witnessed, the two boys naturally gravitated toward each other. Timothy showed Marcus the intricate details of the grand ballroom, the ceiling paintings, the crystal chandeliers, the flower arrangements on the tables, with the enthusiasm of a child sharing his favorite treasures. "Do you want to see the fountain outside?" Timothy asked, taking Marcus's hand. "It has colored lights, and sometimes I throw coins in and make wishes." "What do you wish for?" Marcus asked with the genuine curiosity of childhood. "I used to wish for a brother," Timothy replied with the simple honesty that only children possess. "I think my wish came true." Meanwhile, Richard watched a taxi pull up to the hotel entrance through the large ballroom windows. A small, familiar figure stepped out of the vehicle, Maria Santos, still in her cleaning uniform, her dark hair tied back in a simple ponytail, rushing through the marble entrance of the Palmer House Hilton as if her life depended on it. Hotel security initially tried to stop her, her humble appearance starkly contrasting with the tuxedos and gowns, but Richard waved them off to let her in. When Maria entered the grand ballroom, her eyes immediately found Marcus, and the relief on her face was palpable. "Marcus!" she called, and the boy ran to her at lightning speed. "Mommy!" Marcus shouted, throwing himself into her arms. "I found him. I found my dad." Maria held her son with the strength of someone who'd feared losing him, repeatedly kissing the top of his head as she murmured words of relief in Spanish and English. When she finally lifted her eyes, she saw Richard and Catherine approaching. The conversation that followed between the three adults was quiet, respectful, focused entirely on the children's well-being. Maria asked for nothing, no back child support, no financial claims, no demands. She just wanted to make sure Marcus would be treated with the love and respect every child deserves. Richard, in turn, didn't try to buy her cooperation or silence. Instead, he asked only one question. "How can I be the best father possible to him from now on?" Catherine watched the interaction with growing fascination. She was seeing a completely new side of her husband, not the controlling CEO or calculating politician, but simply a man desperately trying to do the right thing after years of doing the wrong one. As the night wore on and the last guests finally left, an extraordinary scene unfolded in the nearly empty grand ballroom. The two boys had found a corner where they could play, using linen napkins as paper airplanes and racing around the empty tables. Their laughter echoed through the vast space, a pure and genuine sound that beautifully contrasted with all the artificiality that had filled the room hours before. Timothy was teaching Marcus a complicated game involving hopping between the marble floor patterns, and Marcus was showing Timothy how to fold origami with the napkins, a skill his mother had taught him during long nights when he couldn't sleep. Richard, Catherine, and Maria stayed close by, not really supervising, but simply absorbing the magnitude of what had happened. The night had started as a political fundraiser and had transformed into something far deeper. A family reunion, a moral lesson, a moment of truth none of them would ever forget. The children, in their innocent wisdom, had navigated the emotional complexities of the situation with a grace that shamed the adults. Where adults saw scandal, legal complications, political ramifications, and social fallout, the children saw only the simple, pure opportunity to be brothers. Timothy and Marcus, laughing together as they built an imaginary fortress from gold chairs and linen tablecloths. We're living proof that children are often wiser than adults. They instinctively understand what truly matters: love, family, acceptance, forgiveness. The truth, painful as it had been that night, had indeed freed a family. It had broken the chains of secrets and lies that kept a father and son apart for needless years. It had forced four adults to confront who they really were when all social masks were removed. The final image of that extraordinary night was of the two boys finally together. Not just blood brothers, but brothers in heart, their voices blending in perfect harmony as they planned all the adventures they would have together. Marcus was excitedly describing the playground near his apartment, and Timothy was promising to show him his room and his toy car collection. It was a picture no amount of money could have bought. No political campaign could have orchestrated. No social strategy could have planned. It was simply two children discovering they had found each other, and from that moment on, they would never be alone again. And maybe that was the true lesson of the night. Sometimes it takes the smallest, purest voices to teach us the most important truths about what it really means to be human.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.